Section 56 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 36. The night after Inglesant had met the friar in Naples, there was the sound of abundance of rain, and the plague was stayed. As constantly happened in the cities desolated by this mysterious pestilence, no adequate reason could be perceived for its cessation. Some change in the state of the atmosphere took place, and the sick did not die, at least in the same proportion as formerly. This was the only indication that the most acute observer could detect, but the change was marvellously rapid. The moment that contact with the dead bodies became less fatally infectious, help offered on all sides, tempted by the large rewards. The dead rapidly disappeared from sight, and the city began to resume something of its ordinary appearance. The terrors of the grave vanished into air, and gloomy resolutions faded from the mind. The few survivors of the devoted men who, throughout the heat of the conflict, had remained at their posts were, many of them at least, forgotten and overlooked, for their presence was an unpleasing reminder to those whose conduct had been of a far more prudent and selfish sort. Those who had fled returned into the city to look after their deserted homes and to reopen their shops. The streets and markets were once more gay with wares. The friar was now as eager to leave Naples as he had before been determined to remain. His sole object was to find the cavalier, and he constantly insisted that no time was to be lost if they wished to see him alive. They left Naples together, the friar mounted upon a mule which Inglesant purchased for him. Notwithstanding the friar's eagerness, their journey was slow, for he was not able to resist the impulse to turn aside to help when any appearance of distress or poverty called upon them for aid. Inglesant was not impatient at this delay, nor at the erratic and apparently meaningless course of their singular journey. The country was delightful after the heavy rains, and seemed to rejoice, together with its inhabitants, at the abatement of the plague. People who had remained shut up in their houses in fear now appeared freely in the once deserted roads. Doors were thrown open, and the voice of the lute and of singing was heard again in the land. As for those who had passed away, it was wonderful how soon their name was forgotten, as of a dead man out of mind, and those who had come into comfortable inheritance of fruit-closes and olive grounds and vineyards, and of houses of pleasure in the fields, which, but for the pestilence, had never been theirs, soon found it possible to reconcile themselves to the absence of the dead. For some time after leaving Naples, the road lay through a richly cultivated land, with long straight ditches on either side. Rows of forest trees crossed the country, and shaded the small closes of fruit trees and vines. Here and there a wine tavern, or a few cottages, or a village church stopped them. At all of these the friar alighted from his mule, and made inquiries for any who were ill or in distress. In this way they came across a number of people of the peasant class, and heard the story of their lives, and now and then a religious or a country signore, riding by on his mule or palfrey, stopped to speak with them. They had proceeded for many days through this cultivated country, and had at last, after many turnings, reached that part of the road which approaches the slopes of the Apennines about Frosinone. The path wound among the hills, the slopes covered with chestnut trees, and the crags crowned with the remains of Gothic castles. Fields of maize filled the valleys, and lines of lofty poplars crossed the yellow corn. As the road ascended, distant reaches of forest and campagna lay in bright sunlight between the craggy rocks, and down the wooded glens cascades fell into rapid streams spanned here and there by a half-ruined bridge. At last they entered a deep ravine of volcanic tufa, much of which cropped out from the surface, cold and bare. Between these sterile rocks laurels forced their way and spread out their broad and brilliant leaves. Creeping plants hung in long and waving festoons, and pines and forest trees of great size crowned the summits. Here and there sepulchral excavations were cut in the rock. and more than one sarcophagus carved with figures in relief stood by the wayside. The air in these ravines was close and hot, and sulphurous streams emitted an unpleasant odour as they rode along. Inglesant felt oppressed and ill. The valley of the shadow of death, out of which he had come into the cool pastures and olive yards, had left upon the mind an exaltation of feeling rather than terror, and in the history of the friar, through the course of which traces of a devised plan penetrated the confusion of a disordered brain, the gracious prediction of Molinos seemed to promise fulfilment. The supreme effort of divine mercy surely is that which shapes the faltering and unconscious actions of man into a beneficent and everlasting work. But the very clearness and calm of this transcendental air produced a wavering of the spiritual sense, and the companionship of a blind enthusiast, who, from the lowest depth of reckless sin, had suddenly attained a height of religious fervour, did not tend to reduce the fever of his thoughts. The scenes and forms of death with which he had been familiar in Naples returned again and again before his eyes, and his old disease again tormented him, so that once more he saw strange figures and shapes walking by the wayside. These images of a disordered fancy jostled and confused his spiritual perceptions. He felt wearied by those thoughts and desires which had formerly been dear to him, and the ceaseless reiteration of the friar's enthusiastic conceptions jarred and irritated him more than he liked to confess. The brain of the blind man, unoccupied by the sights of this world, was full of visions of a mystic existence, blended and confused with such incidents and stories of earth as he had heard along the way. With such phantasmal imaginations he filled Inglesant's ears. Proceeding in this manner, they came to a place where the ravine, opening out a little, exposed a distant view of the Campagna, with its aqueducts and ruined tombs. At the opening of the valley stood one of those isolated rocks so strange to English eyes, yet so frequently seen in the paintings of the old masters, crowned with the ruins of a temple, and fringed with trees of delicate foliage, poplars and pines. At the foot of the rock, an arch of ruined brickwork, covered with waving grass and creepers, spanned the road with a wide sweep, and on the opposite side a black sulphurous pool exhaled a constant vapour. Masses of strange, nameless masonry, of an antiquity dateless and undefined, bedded themselves in the rocks or overhung the clefts of the hills, and out of a great tomb by the wayside near the arch, a forest of laurel forced its way, amid delicate and graceful frieze-work, moss-covered and stained with age. In this strangely desolate and ruinous spot, where the fantastic shapes of nature seemed to mourn in weird fellowship with the shattered strength and beauty of the old pagan art life, there appeared unexpectedly signs of modern dwelling. The base of the precipitous rock for some distance above the road was concealed by a steep bank of earth, the crumbling ruin and dust of man and of his work. At the top of this bank was one of those squalid erections so common in Italy, where, upon a massive wall of old brickwork embedded in the soil, a roof of straw affords some kind of miserable shelter. Some attempt had been made to wall in the space covered by this roof, and a small cross, reared from the gable, and a bell beneath a penthouse of wood, seemed to show that the shed had been used for some ecclesiastical purpose. At the bottom of the slope upon which this structure was placed, and on the other side of the ruined arch and of the road, there stood, near to the tomb, a very small hut, also thatched, and declared to be a tavern by its wine-bush. At the door of this hut, as Inglesant and the friar rode up, stood a man in a peasant's dress, in an attitude of perplexity and nervous dread. A long streak of light from the western sun penetrated the ruined arch and shone upon the winding road, and against the blaze of light, rock and arch and hanging woods stood out dark and lowering in the delicate air. The dazzling light, the close atmosphere of the valley, and the fumes of the sulphurous lake affected Inglesant's brain so much that he could scarcely see, but they did not appear to disturb the friar. He addressed the man as they came up, and understanding more from his own instinct than from the few words that Inglesant spoke that the man was in trouble, he said, "You seem in perplexity, my son. Confide in me, that I may help you." As the man hesitated to reply, Inglesant said, "What is that building on the hill?" "It is a house for lepers," said the peasant. "Are you the master of this tavern?" said Inglesant. "No, Santa Madre," replied the man. "The mistress of the inn has fled. This is the case, padre," he continued, turning to the friar. "I was hired a week or so ago at Ariano to bring a diseased man here who was a leper, but I did not know that he was a leper who was stricken with the plague. I brought him in my cart, and a terrible journey I had with him. When I had brought him here, and the plague manifestly appeared upon him, all the lepers fled and forsook the place. The padrona, who kept this tavern upon such custom as the peasants who brought food to sell to the lepers brought her, also fled. I stayed a day or two to help the wretched man. They told me that he was a gentleman, till I could stay no longer, such was his condition, and I fled. But, my father, I have a tender heart, and I came back today thinking that the Holy Virgin would never help me if I left a wretched man to die alone. I, who only know where and in what state he is. I spoke to 1 or 2 friars to come and help me, but they excused themselves. I came alone. But when I arrived here, my courage failed me, and I dared not go up. I know the state he was in 2 days ago. He must be much more terrible to look at now. Signore," concluded the man, turning to Inglesant with an imploring gesture, "I dare not go up." "Do you know this man's name?" said Inglesant. "Yes, they told me his name." "What is it?" "Il cavaliere di Guardino." At the name of his wife's brother, Inglesant started and would have dismounted, but checked himself in the stirrup, struck by the action of the friar. He had thrown his arms above his head with a gesture of violent excitement, his sightless eyeballs extended, his face lighted with an expression of rapturous astonishment and delight. "Who?" he exclaimed. "Who sayest thou? Guardino a leper and stricken with the plague? Deserted and helpless is he? Too terribly disfigured to be looked upon? The lepers flee him, sayest thou? Holy and blessed Lord Jesus, this is thy work. He is my mortal foe, the ravisher of my sister, the destroyer of my own sight. Let me go to him. I will minister to him. I will tend him. Let me go." He dismounted from his mule, and with the wonderful instinct he seemed to possess, turned towards the rock and began to scramble up the hill, blindly and with difficulty, it is true, but still with sufficient correctness to have reached the ruin without help. There was to Inglesant something inexpressibly touching and pitiful in his hurried and excited action, and his struggling determination to accomplish the ascent. The peasant would have overtaken him to prevent his going up, probably misdoubting his intention. Inglesant checked him. "Do not stop him," he said. "He is a holy man, and will do what he says. I will go with him. Stay here with my horse." "You do not know to what you are going, signore," said the peasant, looking at Inglesant with a shudder. "Let him go alone. He cannot see." Inglesant shook his head, and, his brain still slightly dizzy and confused, hastened after the friar and assisted him to climb the rocky bank. When they had reached the entrance to the hut, the friar went hastily in, Inglesant following him to the doorway. It was a miserable place and nearly empty, the lepers having carried off most of their possessions with them. On a bed of straw on the farther side, beneath the rock, lay what Inglesant felt to be the man of whom he was in search. What he saw it is impossible to describe here. The leprosy and the plague combined had produced a spectacle of inexpressible loathing and horror, such as nothing but absolute duty would justify the description of. The corruption of disease made it scarcely possible to recognize even the human form. The poisoned air of the shed was such that a man could scarcely breathe it and live. The wretched man was rolling on his couch, crying out at intervals, groaning and uttering oaths and curses. Without the slightest faltering, the friar crossed the room. It is true he could not see, and kneeling by the bedside, which he found at once, he began, in low and hurried accents, to pour into the ear of the dying man the consoling sound of that name, which alone, uttered unto heaven, has power to reach the departing soul, distracted to all beside. Startled by the sound of a voice close to his ear, for his sight also was gone, the sick man ceased his outcries and lay still. Never ceasing for a moment, the friar continued in a rapid and fervent whisper to pour into his ear the tenderness of Jesus to the vilest sinner, the eternal love that will reign hereafter, the sweetness and peace of the heavenly life. The wretched man lay perfectly still, probably not knowing whether this wonderful voice was of earth or heaven, and Inglesant, his senses confused by the horrors of the room, knelt in prayer in the entrance of the hut. The fatal atmosphere of the room became more and more dense. The voice of the friar died slowly away. His form, bending lower over the bed, faded out of sight, and there passed across Inglesant's bewildered brain the vision of another who stood beside the dying man. The halo round his head lighted all the hovel, so that the seamless coat he wore and the marks upon his hands and feet were plainly seen, and the pale, alluring face was turned not so much upon the bed and upon the monk as upon Inglesant himself, and the unspeakable glance of the divine eyes met his. A thrill of ecstasy, terrible to the weakened system as the sharpest pain, together with the fatal miasma of the place, made a final rush and grasp upon his already reeling faculties, and he lost all consciousness and fell senseless within the threshold of the room. When he came to himself, he had been dragged out of the hut by the peasant who had ventured at last to ascend the hill. The place was silent. The cavalier was dead, and the friar lay across the body in a sort of trance. They brought him out and laid him on the grass, thinking for some time that he was dead also. By and by he opened his sightless eyes and asked where he was, but he still moved as in a trance. He seemed to have forgotten what had happened, and with the death of the cavalier, the great motive which had influenced him, and which, while it lasted, seemed to have kept his reason from utterly losing its balance, appeared to be taken away. He had lived only to meet and bless his enemy, and this having been accomplished, all reason for living was gone. Inglesant and the peasant dug a grave with some implements they found in the tavern, and hastily buried the body, the friar pronouncing a benediction. The latter performed this office mechanically, and seemed almost unconscious as to what was passing. His very figure and shape appeared changed, and presented but the shadow of his former self. His speech was broken and unintelligible. Inglesant gave the peasant money, which seemed to him to be wealth, and they mounted and rode silently away. At Venafro, where they found a monastery of the Cappuccini, they stayed some days, Inglesant expecting that his companion would recover something of his former state of health. But it soon became apparent that this would not be the case. The friar sank rapidly into a condition of mental unconsciousness, and the physicians told Inglesant that although he might linger for weeks, they believed that a disease of the brain was hastening him towards the grave. Inglesant was impatient to return to the castello, and leaving the friar to the care of the brothers of his own order, he resumed his journey. Was it a strange coincidence, or the omniscient rule and will of God, that at the moment Inglesant lay insensible before the hut, the plague had done its work in the home that he had left? The old count died first, then some half of the servants. Finally, in the deserted house, a little child lay dead upon its couch, and beside it, on the marble floor, lay Loretta, dead, uncared for. It was the opinion of Martin Luther that visions of the Saviour, which he himself had seen, were delusions of Satan for the bewildering of the papists. And there is a story of a monk who left the beatific vision that he might take his service in the choir. Malvolti died at Venafro a short time after Inglesant had left him. End of section 56. Read by Belinda McReynolds, Melbourne, 31st October 2024.